These are the states and provinces surrounding the northwestern part of the United States, and these are the states and provinces that have true destination ski resorts. Notice anything weird? Okay, so if you're watching this video, you probably think of Washington and Oregon for their rainy weather and coffee rather than snow. So the first thing you might start to think is, well, maybe these states don't have any ski resorts at all. But you'd be wrong. Not only do these states offer multiple ski mountains across various regions, but each spans an extensive range of shapes, sizes, and terrain types. So why is nobody hopping on a plane to ski or ride in Washington and Oregon? And has everyone been getting it wrong the whole time? Well, it turns out that there's a lot more going on here than initially meets the eye. So let's take a closer look at two of the most mystifying states for skiing and riding in North America. One very important circumstance surrounding the Washington and Oregon resorts is that the overwhelming majority of them are close to large cities. 4 major Washington ski areas are within 2 hours of Seattle, while 3 major Oregon ski areas sit within 2 hours of Portland. Combined, these cities have a metropolitan area population of over 6 million people. This means there's already a massive visitor pool for these mountains based on nearby residents alone, and they don't need to attract visitors from out of state to get business. But the demand in these regions takes the situation even further. It's not just that these resorts don't need destination visitors, it's that there's so much visitation from locals that there isn't even room for outside vacationers. In fact, access road traffic and on-mountain crowds have been so unsustainable at some of these mountains that they've chosen to implement reservations, some paid, or even turn people away after certain hours. Most of these resorts are on some sort of mega pass, with Crystal and Snoqualmie on the Icon Pass, Stevens Pass on Epic, and a few resorts on more under-the-radar products such as Indy. But these pass issuers haven't exactly been going out of their way to market these mountains and their capacity issues. In the case of Crystal, the resort cut Icon access back from unlimited to 5 or 7 day access to control the number of locals who visit, and replaced unlimited access on Icon with a standalone wallet-draining $1,900 season pass. Another factor that reflects the region's commuter-oriented nature, night skiing operations. Unlike most Rockies destination resorts, every ski resort within reasonable commuting distance of Seattle and Portland hosts some flavor of night operations. Mount Hood Ski Bowl and Summit at Snoqualmie, in particular, are known for making night skiing a central part of their offerings. Oregon's Mount Bachelor might be the notable exception to this major metro area rule and the associated impacts. The nearest town is Bend, which is only about 1/10 of the size of Portland. But Bend has also grown a ton in recent years and now is substantially bigger than most typical ski towns. And while still manageable, on-site crowds have definitely increased at Mount Bachelor as well. Okay, but what if you wanted to visit these resorts on an off-peak weekday, when they're at least relatively empty? Well, when it comes to terrain, some of Washington and Oregon's resorts do offer slope setups that look competitive with other destinations on paper. The best resorts, including Crystal, Mount Bachelor, and Mount Hood Meadows, feature sizable footprints that take multiple days to cover, with diverse terrain ranging from bowls to trees to treacherous challenges. However, for many fly-to vacation goers, the Pacific Northwest mountains take a lot longer to travel to than competing mountains in Colorado and Utah. And while their terrain is definitely enjoyable, for most travelers, the experiences won't stand out enough to justify the extra flight time. In terms of distance, it's easy to compare these states to places like Whistler and Tahoe, which are just as tough or even tougher to get to than Washington and Oregon's resorts. However, both of those destinations offer truly extraordinary features, such as a world-class footprint size in the case of Whistler, and one-of-a-kind lake views in the case of Tahoe that presents something starkly different than the slopes of the Rockies, and as a result, might encourage typical vacationers to go out of their way to ski or ride there. But when it comes to Washington and Oregon, for most out-of-towners, the best resorts in those states just don't have that same wow factor to justify the extra travel time. Another factor that significantly detracts from the destination appeal in these states, perhaps even more than the terrain itself, is the substantial on-site lodging and activity deficit. For many destination vacationers, the inability to stay in a slopeside ski town will essentially be a deal breaker. Both states have exactly one large resort with true ski-in, ski-out accommodations, Timberline Lodge in Oregon and Crystal in Washington. The accommodations at both resorts have a ton of character, and in the case of Timberline, the Seoul Hotel is designated as a National Historic Landmark, but capacity is extremely limited and spots fill up quickly. Summit at Snoqualmie and Mount Hood Ski Bowl do offer accommodations that sit a short walk or drive from the slopes, but they're primarily bargain basement and not designed to attract people for high-class hotel experiences, yet they still end up being really expensive due to the low supply. Okay, so if you can't stay directly on site, is there anything at least nearby? After all, some folks may not mind a short drive to reach the mountains, even if it's mildly inconvenient. Unfortunately, options in close proximity to these resorts tend to be nearly as limited as those directly on the slopes. With the exceptions of the hotels and inns we already mentioned, the nearest practical lodging options require a considerable drive, with reasonable accommodations living as far as 45 minutes away from the most remote resorts. In addition to the lack of lodging, none of these resorts come with any sort of true slopeside mountain town, so there aren't really many activities going on around the slopes either. In fact, if you want to do anything after your day skiing or riding, such as checking out an off-premise restaurant, town, or bar, it'll take a drive that's just as lengthy as reaching the nearest accommodations. And unless you're in Bend, which is actually a really cool town, you'll pretty much be in the Seattle, Portland, or Bellingham suburbs by that point. Even though most of these mountains are only within an hour or two of Seattle or Portland, once the terrain turns mountainous, both of these states get really remote really quickly. The drives to and from these mountains are far from straightforward. Due to mountainous terrain, rapid freeze-thaw changes, and variable visibility, the conditions on access roads to all of these resorts can be extremely sketchy. As a result, driving to these mountains is not fun, and public transportation options can be limited, making it really difficult to plan a multi-day trip to most of these mountains. In fact, Stevens Pass stopped operating their buses to the resort due to the road conditions, and if you don't want to drive, you now have to carpool there. Not exactly relaxing for a destination vacation. If you've made it this far through the video, you can probably agree that there's no better way to have fun during the winter than going on a ski trip. But let's be honest, there are very few things that will make you want to pull your hair out more than planning that trip. Enter Peak Rankings Trips. We can plan your lodging, lift tickets, and even road trip itinerary. To get started, click the link in the description below. Now, back to the video. So you might be thinking, everything we've covered so far is a solvable problem with capital investments. Why don't Washington and Oregon just build more ski resorts to address the demand? Or at least expand the ones they have to make them more competitive, and maybe add some on-site lodging while they're at it too? Well, it turns out that both states have their hands somewhat tied. Specifically in Washington, developable ski resort terrain is close to maxed out due to national park designations for large swaths of alpine land. There are far fewer national parks in Oregon, but most of its development lands also fall subject to federal wilderness protections. In fact, the national park designation takes some of the craziest potential skiable terrain out of the picture in the state of Washington. Both Rainier National Park and North Cascades National Park have plenty of terrain that could hypothetically make for spectacular inbound skiing and riding, but, while for good reason, they're off limits to any sort of development. When you visit Washington State, it becomes apparent that the resorts tried to make the most of the land they could before they encroached into national park territory. Mount Baker is just outside the bounds of North Cascades National Park, while Crystal is a short distance east from Rainier National Park and Mount Rainier itself. In the case of Oregon, the state is unique in that the vast majority of its truly prominent mountains are volcanoes. In fact, all of Oregon's current major ski resorts are either on a volcano or immediately adjacent to one. However, while there are several volcanoes that don't currently have any ski resorts, including the Three Sisters and Mount Jefferson, a large portion of this land is protected wilderness, making those sites just as off limits to development as the parks in Washington. Okay, but what if we set the land restrictions aside for a second and just consider Washington and Oregon for their land alone? Well, it turns out that there's one final circumstance that really hurts these states for resort development, and it's the climate conditions. Part of going on a ski trip involves cold weather, but in return, guests will often find iconic, serene atmospheres. Washington and Oregon slopes aren't as cold as many competitors, but a number of factors can make the resorts really uncomfortable. If you only take a surface glance at the stats, things actually look pretty good conditions-wise, especially when it comes to snow accumulation. In fact, snow totals at the best resorts are much higher than those at most Utah and Colorado mountains, and Mount Baker, which sits in the most favorable snow line of the state, often receives the highest snow totals of any ski resort on the continent. However, there is a huge catch to this accumulation. Snowfall tends to be wet and heavy, and frankly unpleasant to plow through in certain conditions. The snow sticks on outerwear, and visitors will often find themselves soaked after extensive time out in the mountains. Another crucial factor for a top-notch destination ski vacation is the presence of stunning alpine views, and while the resorts in these states fit the bill when they're clear, slopes are perennially overcast during the core winter months, making for less than picturesque experiences. Fog poses a significant challenge at all Washington ski resorts, and it's often impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you, making for scary conditions. And from a practical standpoint, it can be really annoying to keep your goggles unfogged in these moist conditions. All these resorts occasionally get rained on, and combined with the deep, heavy snow, these factors result in some wonky, unpredictable conditions that may come across as unpleasant surprises to those who visit. Oregon ski resorts tend to experience a bit drier and less fog-prone conditions than those in Washington, but the volcanoes that host these ski resorts drive local weather patterns that result in intense weather events and tremendously variable conditions. As a result, throughout most of the winter season, Oregon ski resorts face significant operational challenges. Most of the state's expert and above treeline areas either rarely open or remain entirely closed during a typical week-long visit. This means that even if conditions are clear, visitors expecting to explore the destination-grade footprints advertised on resort trail maps will likely end up disappointed. So while some of Washington and Oregon ski resorts may seem like great destinations on paper, the states just have factor after factor working against them to allow for destination ski resort development. National park and forest restrictions, wet, difficult weather, and overcapacity from the local population just hurt the case for any of the resorts in these states to become true fly-to destinations. We will also caveat that Mount Bachelor, the biggest resort in this region, does not fall victim to many of the worst issues that plague some of its neighbors, including horrible traffic, sketchy access roads, and small footprints. But we'd argue it's still just too far away from the nearest lodging options to drive appeal from typical destination crowds. But just because Washington and Oregon don't have any traditional destinations, does that mean you shouldn't visit them? Absolutely not. Both states have incredible qualities that make them worth checking out for adventurous, commuter-ready powderhounds who want to check out some of the most extreme, snow-laden slopes on the continent and have the glutes and stamina to power through the wet, heavy accumulation. The resorts also get a lot drier and clearer during the spring, so if you're looking for some corn skiing in April or May, it might not only be a great trip option, but be the best time to visit these states from other regions. For more information on Washington, Oregon, and over 90 North American ski resort destinations, check out peakrankings.com. See you for the next one.